This right here is a $250 PC that I built that can play plenty of games at 1080p, and it has great aesthetics as well. Now for the price point, I think it's pretty amazing because you're not only just getting performance, but you're also getting good looks out of this PC as well. As you can see, I'm using a case that has RGB. Basically, you can change it to whatever color you want. I was able to also squeeze in some cable extensions as well. And I'm talking about $250 after tax prices as well, not before tax. Now, of course, this was only possible by using used parts instead of new parts. While there are some parts in here that are new, most of the parts in this build are going to be used. Now, speaking about the parts, let me talk about the parts that I chose in this build and their prices as well. Starting off with the parts list, I got a CPU motherboard combo, which came with an i7-3770. The motherboard itself was a Dell XPS motherboard. It came with 16GB of DDR3 and of course the CPU cooler, all in total for $70.04, which in my opinion I think is a pretty good deal. And once again, that was the price after tax, which I have gotten off of eBay. Moving on to the GPU, I got this in my local area off of OfferUp. I got a GTX 1660. It was an EVGA card with a single fan, but it had a pretty thick heatsink. I got this for $50, which I think was also a pretty good price at the time as well. Moving on to the power supply, I also got this off of OfferUp, and I know buying a power supply used isn't really the most ideal thing in the world, but in this case it worked out perfectly fine for the build and it performed well as well. I got an EVGA 500 watt BQ power supply. Now this power supply is semi-modular, so there won't be a bunch of cable mess in the actual PC itself, which makes cable management a whole lot easier. And I was able to snag this thing for just $20. Moving on to our storage, I bought this brand new off of Amazon. It is the T-Force Vulcan Z, and I've used this in many builds before. It is a perfectly fine SSD to put in a build. It is only 512 gigabytes, and if you wanted to, you could pay just that little bit extra for 1 terabyte. Moving on to the case, I have this DIY PC case. I will put the full name up on the screen for you. And it does have RGB features such as the RGB color logo in the front and an RGB fan in the back. It does only come with that one fan, and I was able to throw in an extra fan that I had on hand, but it's not required, so I'm not going to put that in the price. I got this case off of Newegg brand new for $48.43 after tax. And then finally, the cable extensions. It is just some Asia Horse cable extensions, all white, which after tax came out to $24.52. And with that, my grand total for this entire build came out to $241.32, which is right under that $250 mark, which I think is pretty impressive. What's even more impressive than that price is the performance that I was able to get with this system as well. And what is also pretty impressive about this build is the aesthetic. Not only is the performance also just very pleasing, but so is the look of this PC. Now it could be improved with probably a different CPU cooler, probably something like a white CPU cooler from ID Cooling, like this one that I'll show up on the screen. It would add to the looks a lot more, and maybe a different motherboard since it is kind of green and looks a little funky, but I'm pretty impressed with what I was able to pull off. Now I know I've been talking about the performance a lot about this PC, so let's go ahead and move on to some benchmarks. Now starting off with our first game, Apex Legends, I was able to play on high settings and we were able to get over 100 FPS. Now if we did lower the settings to like a medium low or even just all low, you might even be able to get over 144 and still have that high refresh rate experience. But overall, I was pretty impressed and wasn't expecting this amount of performance on Apex, even on high settings. The fact that it was able to get over 100 FPS was just astounding to me. I was just overall impressed. Moving on to Overwatch 2, on the high preset, it did a really good job of staying above 144 FPS. There were a good amount of times where it would dip below that. I feel like if you were to turn down the settings to maybe even medium or low, you would definitely be able to have that solid 144 frames per second, or maybe even limiting the frames and turning on VSync might be able to keep that high refresh rate up as well. But other than that, Overwatch 2 ran perfectly fine. I had no issues with Overwatch 2, and it was just a great experience overall. Moving on to Rainbow Six Siege on the Ultra preset with Vulkan to API, I was averaging over 140 FPS, even 150, which was pretty impressive in my opinion. I didn't expect to get that much on Ultra, but surprisingly I was able to. And if you were to turn down the settings, once again, same story with Overwatch 2, same story with Apex, I'm sure you would be able to get that high refresh rate experience, and it would just be really enjoyable. Moving on to Halo Infinite on the medium preset, this is where the last PC, my $175 PC, really struggled because of the 4 cores and 4 threads. With this CPU we have 4 cores and 8 threads, which is a lot of help. As you can see on these benchmarks, that my CPU, while it did have pretty high usage, it never really reached 100%, which is what we were looking for. With our last build, the $175 build, you saw that the CPU was basically maxed out the entire time. My game on this PC was running smoothly at around 100 FPS, which is really good, and that was what I wasn't even expecting, that much FPS for it to even run. It did dip into the 80s a few times. It was mostly in the 90s, I would say, but on average, I would see it sit in the hundreds, depending on what's going on screen, of course. Either way, I'm still really impressed with the way that this game ran, and I was not expecting these results. Moving on to Forza Horizon 5, on the high preset, it was running very similarly to how the $175 PC was running. The frame rates were very similar. I'm not exactly sure of why they were running almost the exact same, even though I know this PC does have better hardware. It might have been that the i5 in that other build was just on a newer architecture, probably better clock speeds if I'm correct as well. I can't really remember the specs of both CPUs right now at this exact moment, but if I were to assume why, that's what I'm guessing. Other than that, no complaints with Forza Horizon 5, ran perfectly fine, and was a pretty playable experience. Moving on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, on the balanced preset with ultra quality NVIDIA image scaling turned on, my frame rate was pretty consistent, ranging mainly in the mid 70s, the low 70s, sometimes dipping into the 60s, but staying above 60 FPS, so that's what I like to see with this. How it would perform in Warzone, I'm assuming it would run just a little bit worse, mainly consisting in the 60s, maybe even dipping into the 50s, but for the most part, Modern Warfare 2 ran pretty well, and I'm assuming on different maps it's going to also affect the performance differently as well. So that is going to wrap it up for this $250 PC. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and it was definitely an accomplishment for me anyways to build something like this. It is very comparable to my $300 PC that I have built, but in my opinion this one performs better and runs better. I also forgot to mention that I did add a USB 2.0 or USB 3.0 to USB 2.0 adapter into the system. This thing's like $5, so still under that $250 mark. It's not needed to make the system work. You still have plenty of USB ports, but since there is one on this case, I just kind of threw it in there. It's optional if you guys want to do the same, if you even want to replicate this build. Other than that, hope you guys enjoy the video, and I'll see you in the next one.